on your Sunday. Obviously, no football fans in the room. I was a little concerned that no one would show because the football games are on today. So I appreciate you all being here. As Mahalani mentioned, my name is Andy. I have a pretty unique position. My background is in geology, and the position that I have with Sea Grant is actually a cost share position with the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources. So I'm extension faculty with UH, but I actually work as a scientific and technical advisor to a state government agency here in Hawaii. The work that I do, I'm the state shoreline specialist. So my job is to locate the certified shoreline, which is the baseline for Hawaii's shoreline setbacks for coastal development. It's also the jurisdictional boundary between the state conservation district, which was seaward or makai of the shoreline, and the county special management area, which is Mauka or landward of the shoreline. I've had the unique experience of having physically walked over 1/3 of Hawaii's 750 miles of shoreline. So I've seen a lot of the islands, most of all of them actually at this point that are at least developed. Haven't gotten to Kaho'olawe or Ni'ihau yet, but I'm working on that. So I've kind of had the unique experience of seeing so much of Hawaii's shorelines. And the office that I work in, really, we work on the front lines of dealing with sea level rise and dealing with beach erosion. Our office does all of the permitting for the beach nourishment projects that we do here in Hawaii. We also review all of the permits for any shore protection structures like seawalls and revetments and things like that. So beach erosion and sea level rise are really the two big focus areas that the office I support works on. So what I want to talk about today, I want to talk about sea level rise, past, present, and future. The past being what we've observed, what the historical trends are, what we know about sea level rise. The present being kind of where we are today, the process, the discovery process that we're going through, and learning about sea level rise and what we can do about it, and what our projections are for the future and what our plans are in terms of how to address the issue. Anytime I talk about sea level rise or climate change, I always like to start with a slide like this, kind of something that encompasses the full range of different climate change related impacts that we're seeing globally and locally. Sea level rise is obviously the focus of this talk, but there are many other climate related threats that are apparent globally and locally. You know, there's really no question that climate is changing at this point. There's overwhelming consensus within the scientific community. All of our observations and models have confirmed this, and there's a consensus that, you know, there's the anthropogenic component, that man is having a significant impact on that through our global emissions and our choices with land use. All of the modeling projections are basically showing that we can expect surface temperatures to continue to rise. We can expect our weather patterns to change, drier areas becoming drier, wetter areas becoming wetter, storm patterns changing to perhaps more frequent and more intense storms. Our oceans are going to continue to acidify, resulting in more bleaching events like we've seen here in Hawaii the last 2 consecutive years. And then obviously the issue of our rising sea levels, which are projected to continue. Working here in Hawaii, sea level rise has really sort of emerged to be the paramount issue of concern as it pertains to climate change, at least in terms of short-term planning. We don't have a lot of resources to dedicate to these issues at this time. So we've sort of tried to prioritize our human resources and our funding on addressing the sea level rise issue. So what are we seeing globally in terms of sea level rise? From about 1700 to 1800, sea level was relatively static. There was a very small amount of rise. From 1800 to 1900, we saw that rise start to incrementally increase to the tune of about 3 inches per century. Still nothing of a large magnitude, but an observable change. Then from 1800 to 1900, we saw that rate rise again, particularly in the latter part of the 1900s, from 1990 to 2000, 1993 to 2010, we saw the rate double from 1.7 millimeters a year to 3.2 millimeters per year. So in addition to having a sea level rise trend during that 20th century period, it was right toward the end of the 20th century going into the 21st that we saw this kind of rapid acceleration and a near doubling of the rate. So that's where a lot of this concern is born from. Where we're going in terms of the coming century out to our long-term planning horizon being around 2100. Global projections range anywhere from about 2 feet to up to 1 meter or more. So that's kind of our planning target right now. We're looking at conservatively about 1 meter of sea level rise by 2100, but most of us believe that that's too conservative. So the primary drivers of sea level rise are thermal expansion of our ocean waters. Our surface air temperatures are increasing due to greenhouse gas emissions, and the ocean accounts for about 90% of the thermal uptake of that additional energy. As ocean water warms, it gains in density and increases in volume. So that's where the majority of the sea level rise is coming from, with additional contributions from glacial melting and collapse of portions of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. A lot of the models that are being done today for sea level rise aren't really accounting for the ice sheet contribution, which is fairly significant. And then land water storage is another kind of interesting issue. It's not contributing directly to sea level rise. Land water storage refers to our anthropogenic attempts to retain fresh water, whether for agricultural purposes, building dams for hydroelectric power, things like that. A lot of that fresh water would naturally be making its way into the ocean. So our sea level rise projections don't really account for that, and it's likely that they would be slightly higher if we weren't retaining so much of the fresh water that we do have. So the $1 million question is, how much is sea level going to rise? The short answer to that is we don't really know. There's a lot of uncertainty in the modeling. Most of you have probably heard of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. That's a consortium of national governments from around the world have brought scientists into this consortium to collaborate, to do modeling, to try to see where we're going globally with sea level rise. And the uncertainty is born from a couple of different things. One being the type of model that they're running. There's two primary types of sea level models. There's semi-empirical and process models. Process models are fairly linear in that they look at atmospheric and oceanic, the relationship between atmospheric and oceanic processes. So they don't really consider changes in ice mass and those contributors, whereas the semi-empirical models try to add more physical variables into the models. Without question, the semi-empirical models always project a much larger sea level rise than the process models because they factor more things in, but they also have a higher degree of uncertainty. So as I mentioned, our models at this point really range anywhere from 1 to 2 feet up to 1 meter or more of sea level rise by the end of the century. We've chosen to kind of go with the middle to upper projections there for a planning target to be conservative. I guess the point I'd like to make about the modeling uncertainty, a lot of people kind of harp on that as well. We don't really know what's happening, so that's a reason that we shouldn't invest resources in addressing the problem today. It's a long-term problem. There's too much uncertainty. We have a high degree of uncertainty that sea level is not only going to continue to rise through the end of the century, but continue beyond that. So the uncertainty in the models can't really preclude us from doing the planning that we need to do today. So the conservative estimates by 2050, we're looking at about 1 foot of sea level rise and then 3 to 4 feet by the end of the century. So those are our planning targets. So that's what we're seeing globally. What are we seeing locally here in Hawaii? We are seeing sea level rise throughout the main and northwest Hawaiian Islands. Our sea level rise rates range from about 2.95 millimeters a year on the Big Island to 1.41 millimeters per year on Kauai. The rates diminish as you trend to the northwest from the Big Island out to the Northwest Islands. The reason for that is that the Big Island is still growing in mass. We're still having eruptions of Kilauea. It's still an active volcano. And as it continues to erupt and that new lava hardens, it adds to the size and the overall density of the island. And in doing so, the island becomes heavier and it sinks under its own weight. And there's a process called lithospheric flexure, whereby as the island places more downward pressure on the lithospheric plate that it sits atop, that plate actually bows. So the island is pushing the plate down, and that's actually uplifting the adjacent portions of the plate that the other islands sit on. So that's why our rates are lower, or seemingly lower, as you trend to the northwest. As the years progress and the Hawaii Island stops erupting and it moves off of the hotspot, those rates will probably even out and you'll see a more uniform rate. Most of us won't be here for that. So in addition to sort of our tide gauge observations, there's been some research done. This was a 2014 study that looked at urban Honolulu using tide gauge data to estimate sea level rise through 2100. And what they determined with 95% confidence was that for a mean sea level rise for 2030 of a half a foot, by 2060 about 1 foot, and by 2100 about 2.8 feet of sea level rise. Now these are the mean values. They don't cover the maximums, which go from 0.7 to 4.6 feet. But this is really in line with that sort of 1 meter target that we've been focusing on for planning purposes. I'd like to point out that sea level rise is not, it's a relatively new term. It's only been in the last decade or two that we've really started to use it as a household name in the policy, planning, and engineering communities. But it's not a new process. You know, sea levels have been rising for the last 150 to 200 years. And we've been adapting to sea level rise the whole time. The Native Hawaiians adapted to sea level by building fish ponds, by settling their villages, Mauka of the shoreline away from hazard areas. You know, they planned their fishing activities and their harvesting activities based on how the tides rose and fell. So they were very in tune with where sea level was on a day-to-day basis. When Westerners arrived in Hawaii, you know, our system of land ownership changed and our priorities for coastal development changed. We went from a subsistence culture to a tourism-based culture. So it was around the early to mid 20th century. Interestingly, that was before the adoption of a lot of the environmental rules that govern shoreline development in Hawaii. It was around that time, early mid-century, that we saw a lot of the shoreline armoring erected here in Hawaii that we see today. A lot of the seawalls and the revetments and the shore protection structures. Those were put in place because erosion was starting to get worse around that time. We were having sort of episodic events, tsunamis and high wave events that were eroding our shorelines. And a lot of our development, our land had already been subdivided, and a lot of the homes and businesses had already been constructed, and they were constructed with no consideration of setting them back from the ocean. It was kind of quite the opposite at the time. They were built as close to the ocean as they could because people wanted to maximize the value of their properties and maximize their ocean views and their access to the beaches. So our system of land use at the time wasn't really cognizant or thoughtful about coastal hazards or sea level rise or erosion. And our mentality of how we wanted to develop our shorelines was a lot different than it is today. These are just a couple of photos. I'm not sure. Yeah, there's my green buzzer. This is Rocky Point up on the North Shore, and this is a shoreline over on Kauai. These are just examples of homes that were constructed kind of mid-century, mid-20th century with no setbacks, and this is where we are today. You know, the ocean is taking that land back, and here we are with these homes that are about to fall in the ocean, and it creates a lot of serious problems, not just for the homeowners, but for government and how to deal with those problems. I think that was all I'll say there. Oh, I like this term slowly emerging disaster with sea level rise. I like to refer to it that way because when we think about disasters, things that could really affect our society, you know, really affect our economies and our way of life, we tend to think about hurricanes and tsunamis and really big kind of nasty events like what happened in Indonesia years ago. Sea level rise is more of a slowly emerging disaster in that it's not something that's perceptible to the naked eye on a day-to-day basis. You know, folks like myself that work in this area, we're intensely aware of it, and we spend a lot of time and energy on it. But for the layperson, the average citizen, it's not really a problem they're even aware of. So because of that, you know, it's going to exacerbate all of our other hazards, the big ones we do concern ourselves with, like hurricanes and tsunamis. So what can we expect in terms of impacts here in Hawaii with sea level rise? I'm not going to read this slide to you because it drives me nuts when folks do that. You can read these for yourselves. Basically, there's no good news. A rise in sea level does not do us any good. It only makes more challenges for us. You know, our erosion rates are already bad here in Hawaii. About 70% of our shorelines are eroding. We've lost over 13 miles of beaches already here. You know, and then the disasters that we do prepare for, it's going to be more costly to recover from them because we're not going to be able to rebuild in the same place a lot of times. So these are just some of the impacts that we expect to deal with. I like this photo. This wasn't as a result of sea level rise. This was just a result of some intense rain. But this is the zoo down in urban Honolulu. And, you know, urban Honolulu, the superficial geology in the city is very porous. It's kind of like a sponge. It doesn't hold water very well. So if anyone lives in town, you know that when we get torrential rains, a lot of our streets flood and it ends up looking like this. And I'm going to show you a couple slides later that really demonstrate how sea level rise is going to affect that and result in probably more nuisance flooding for us to deal with on a more regular basis. I have this slide in here because I recently gave a similar talk to a group of floodplain managers, and I included this for them, but it helped me to kind of think through some of the issues from a governance perspective and a engineering perspective. As sea level rises, particularly on dynamic sandy shorelines, there's a multiplier effect for shoreline recession, whereby 1 foot in sea level rise can have a multiplier effect of up to 10, meaning that with 1 foot of sea level rise, you can have up to 100 feet of landward migration of the shoreline. So that's going to result in an expansion of our coastal floodplains, both horizontally from the loss of the reshaping of the coastline, if you will. But there's also this issue of groundwater inundation, where our floodplains are going to flood more regularly. So what was formerly just a lower lying area is now going to be like either an emergent wetland or a frequently flooded area. That creates some serious challenges for floodplain managers, but also for government agencies, planning agencies, the folks I work with most. You have the shoreline, and seaward of that is the conservation district, which is the state's responsibility, and the state has rules that govern that area. That includes all of our beaches and submerged lands. And then malco of the shoreline, landward, you have the county special management area, which is most of the developed areas, the residential and urban areas. One of the concerns about the sea level rise projections is that shoreline is going to continue to move more landward and probably move landward more rapidly. So those government agencies need to work more closely because what's being permitted by the county on the special management area side is eventually, probably in a short amount of time, going to become something that's part of the conservation district. So it's that bifurcation of the shoreline is kind of an issue from a governance perspective. So this is kind of the next section of the talk. I want to go through what we know about sea level rise. Our observations of tide gauges and GPS and satellite altimetry data have taught us a lot. They've allowed us to develop probabilistic scenarios looking out into the future of what we believe sea level rise will do in the coming century and beyond. Those projections have allowed us to update our inundation modeling, our extreme wave modeling, and our catastrophic event modeling. So looking at passive flooding, marine inundation, high surf events, hurricanes, tsunamis, storm surge, things of that nature. We do numerical modeling for all those types of hazards to inform planning along the shoreline, but also evacuation routes and things like that. And we're starting to consider sea level rise now in those models. I mentioned the groundwater inundation. It's very interesting looking at the relationship between the marine inundation component, which is derived from the sea level rise from the marine side, and then the actual groundwater component, which is interrelated with sea level rise, because as our sea levels rise, it places additional pressure on the groundwater, and it rises, our groundwater tables rise, and we have less area to store fresh water. And then we're spending a lot of time and effort looking at the relationship between sea level rise and erosion, so we can understand how our shorelines are going to be reshaped by sea level rise. So looking at areas that might erode or accrete as a result of that change. So beginning with the scenarios, this is an example from NOAA. A lot of different government agencies have created their own scenarios for their own purposes. We tend to look to NOAA. They're the sort of federal coastal zone management agency. They sponsor the Coastal Zone Management Act and the programs that we have here. They've come up with 4 different scenarios. Basically, bad, worse, really bad, and holy crap. And the bad scenario is just the historical rates alone. It doesn't consider any additional contributions from the collapse of the Antarctic or Greenland ice sheets, no additional contributions from glacial melting. And then we move up and up and up until we get to our really bad scenario, which is the maximum plausible amount of thermal uptake in the ocean, maximum plausible amount of ice sheet loss. And that range takes us from about 0.2 meters to 2 meters of rise. So these are their scenarios. Taking that a step further, NOAA is more of a planning agency. We have a lot of other federal programs and state programs that are, actually in charge of capital improvement projects, building things. One of them being the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who's responsible for building a lot of our shore protection structures and levees and things like that. They got a lot of attention, obviously, during Hurricane Katrina with the failure of the levees there. They've taken this a bit further and developed probabilistic scenarios to inform their capital improvement projects. And they actually have an executive order that requires them to include sea level rise projections in their design specifications for their new structures. So they, in a similar fashion, have sort of a low, medium, and high projection. But they've done theirs, they've created a calculator for themselves where they can project out on an annual basis and basically consider the design life of the structure, when it's going to be constructed and how long it's intended to operate. And they can look out at those timelines and see what the sea level rise projection is for a given area for that period of time. So this is really the first time that a government agency has gone this route and quantitatively addressed sea level rise in their planning process. NOAA is also doing work doing data visualization. This is really not so much for planning purposes, but more for outreach to build public awareness. You know, the relationship between public awareness and political will is always interesting. As the public becomes more educated, they tend to vote based on what they know, and politicians tend to respond that way. So it is really important for us to do this kind of stuff so people know what's going on, they're aware of the issue, and it becomes a concern for them as it is for us. NOAA recently, this was just a few years ago, they published some GIS data showing a couple of things. It shows it's sea level rise scenarios of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 feet. So they didn't do it by year. It's not by 2050 or 2100. They just did it by feet. And that shows sea level rise depth, mapping uncertainty, low-lying areas that might be exposed to groundwater inundation. And what we can do with that, if you'll notice the change on the map here, this is the emergence of sea level rise going from 1 to 6 feet in the Honolulu Valley up on the north shore of Kauai. So starting at 1 foot, the green areas being the low-lying areas that are going to be vulnerable to groundwater inundation, and the light blue being low depth and dark blue being high depth of sea level. And this animation just goes from the 1 to the 6 foot scenario. So, you know, if you've ever been to Honolulu, you know that it's a low-lying coastal floodplain. The Honolulu River and Waiole stream mouth converge into the bay there. It's vulnerable to flooding. I used to have some photos in here that are really good that show Honolulu Valley before and after a large rain event, and it has a very difficult time holding water. I'm sorry, it has a very difficult time draining water. It holds water really well. So we've done scenario projections, we've done policy development, we've done data visualization. Now we're doing data integration. So we're actually taking those scenarios and those projections and integrating them into other planning tools that we have. This is an example from the Pacific Islands Ocean Observing System, PACAUS. They took the historical erosion rates that were produced by the University of Hawaii and coupled them with NOAA's visualizations for sea level, and put them into this tool along with National Flood Insurance Program, the FEMA flood zones. So we can get an idea. You can see these transects along the shoreline. They're designed to create little subunits along the shoreline that we can analyze from a quantitative perspective. And we can sort of downscale those to the property level and look at not only what the erosion threat is for an individual property, but also the sea level rise threat. These are still not quite ready for prime time. They're not quite ready to inform planning decisions, but we're getting there. These are the transects again. You can kind of see how they relate to the parcels. I mentioned the extreme wave modeling that we're doing. Everybody knows that here in Hawaii we have extremely large swells, particularly out of the Northwest Pacific. We have 2 that are bearing down on us right now. One's supposed to peak tomorrow and one on Thursday. When we get these huge swells, we have wave overtopping on a lot of our shorelines, and this was an attempt in 2008 to model what extreme wave overtopping would look like under a 1 meter sea level rise scenario. I used to have an animation for this. I'm sorry, it's not working right now, but what this shows is 1 year, 5 year, 10 year, and 25 year inundation plains. And the black area that you see is permanently eroded area. So this was kind of our first attempt in 2008 to model how the shoreline will become reconfigured under rising sea levels. I mentioned the catastrophic event modeling that we're doing. This is primarily for hurricanes and tsunamis, but this project also included a 500-year riverine flood for urban Honolulu. What they did was they modeled 10 tsunami events, 5 historical events, and 5 hypothetical events. They modeled a Category 4 hurricane, which is sort of a worst case event for Hawaii, and a 500-year riverine flood, which is also a worst case event. And they modeled all of these on top of the 1 meter sea level rise projection. And you can see here from This is urban Honolulu. Again, there was really no good news coming out of this. And this is the combined inundation. So they actually looked at all three of those events together, not suggesting that they would all three happen at the same time, but looking at kind of parcel by parcel or pixel by pixel, if you will, the degree to which an area is vulnerable to more than one hazard. I mentioned groundwater inundation. This is really interesting. This was a project that was done again by UH in 2012, looking at the contribution of groundwater inundation versus marine inundation under sea level rise scenarios. They looked at three scenarios, roughly 1, 2, and 3 feet of sea level rise. And what they found was that under a 2 foot, under sort of the medium scenario event, they found that all of the inundation in urban Honolulu, 69% of it was actually caused by groundwater inundation and not marine. And then for the, I'm sorry, I think I had one more there. For the 1 meter event, it was actually 58%. So this suggests that roughly half, if not more than half, of the flooding is going to be a result of groundwater, not just marine inundation. This is another animation showing those scenarios. I'll play that again. It's a little fast, but so you can see what the groundwater inundation component looks like in Honolulu. So kind of the next section of the talk here, I want to introduce some of the information products that we have, planning documents and things of that nature. Not so much to pander these to you or encourage you to go look at them, which I do, but to give you a sense of the journey that we've been on, particularly in the last 5 or so years, 5 to 10 years, and how we are where we are today. Interestingly enough, the Hawaii State Legislature became aware of climate change and sea level rise back in 1985. They commissioned the Office of Planning to develop a report documenting the potential threats associated with climate change and sea level rise. And in that report, which is it's the one on the left over there, it's an old typewriter copy, it's really old. There's actually maps of urban Honolulu that show a line that represents 1 meter of sea level rise. When I first came across that report, I just shook my head and said, geez, are we just reliving the past and doing this again? And I had thought about it some more, and what I realized was that the reason that nothing happened after that 1985 report was that conditions were really different at the time. We had a very residual awareness of the situation. We had no quantitative data for historical erosion. We had no modeling capabilities to model sea level rise. Our observational data was very limited. We hadn't even seen a rapid uptick in sea level rise yet. We hadn't gotten quite to the end of the century. And there was no real consensus in the scientific community that this issue was happening or that we were contributing to it. So the conditions back then were really different. It wasn't until about 2009 that climate change and sea level rise really became household names, and organizations like Sea Grant started working intensively on them. We started developing reports. We did a climate briefing in 2009. We did a report on the relationship between sea level rise and our shoreline setback policies in 2010. And we followed that up with a number of different reports looking at impacts to different sectors. We looked at the relationship between sea level rise and coastal land use law, considering the potential for regulatory takings if government were to intervene and ask people to leave certain areas that are too vulnerable to settle in. So we got into the law side. Then we started getting more into the impact side, which is where we've been just in the past 2 to 3 years. We've had several reports that have come out that have really gotten into the detailed potential impacts of how sea level rise will affect our infrastructure and our populations, our economies. A lot of these were Sea Grant products, but they were in partnership with other organizations as well. So we started with sort of informational products. Then we got more into the nitty gritty of what are the impacts going to be, doing the modeling, building our scientific understanding of it. And that's brought us to kind of where we are now, which is we're getting into the planning and policy development phase, which is really exciting. This started in 2009 with our framework for climate adaptation. It was developed in partnership with the Hawaii Office of Planning, kind of established sort of the overarching framework for how to do climate adaptation in Hawaii. So kind of our guidelines, guiding principles. That was followed up by a series of studies that basically downscaled that further and further. We started with the Sea Level Rise Toolkit in 2011. which basically looked at the portfolio of adaptation options that were available and provided instructions for state and local governments to evaluate and implement them. We worked with Hawaii County and Maui counties in 2012 to do a policy analysis looking at their special management area rules, their shoreline setback rules, their planning commission rules, to basically identify opportunities where we could integrate sea level rise into their existing planning frameworks. So we don't have to basically reinvent the wheel and create a whole new set of rules, which, as you know, government moves slow. So if you want to do something new, it takes a while. So we kind of focused on what we're doing already and how to maybe modify that to be more effective. And then most recently in 2014, we worked with Kauai County to integrate sea level rise into their general plan, which sort of maps out their long-range plan and vision for the county's development into the future. So having done all that, I want to talk a little bit about sea level rise adaptation. There's basically three categories of adaptation. Adaptation applies to any action that we take as an individual, a community, a government, to reduce the impacts of a hazard, in this case sea level rise, and the associated hazards, to basically reduce that vulnerability and increase our resilience. The three options that we have, the three sort of categories are accommodation, protection, and retreat. I'm going to kind of give you examples of each one of those. Accommodation is kind of what we're used to doing. You know, these hazards present themselves on a day-to-day basis. We're used to dealing with them. We kind of just adjust things kind of to the lowest common denominator. You know, we try to spend as little as we can and do as little as we can to just get by. And we do other things as well in government. You know, our shoreline setbacks and our building code requirements and structural retrofitting and things like that. So, you know, the goal being that we have something in place, whether it's a wastewater facility or a residential home, we'd like to keep it there as long as we can. We're invested in it. So what can we do to adapt that to accommodate changing environmental conditions? There's not a real downside to accommodation. It's probably the most cost effective, but we have concerns that our ability to accommodate sea level rise, particularly out toward the end of the century, is probably not great in a lot of areas. The second response, or second form of adaptation, is protection or hardening. That can be hardening of the shoreline, that can be hardening of infrastructure. This has really been our traditional response. You know, you have a beach erosion problem in front of your property, you want to build a seawall, you want to build a revetment. This isn't just here in Hawaii, it's on the US mainland and countries throughout the world. Engineers, you know, they love to do this stuff, and it's fairly easy to build and fairly cost effective. But there are significant downsides to shore protection. It's been proven that seawalls and rock revetments tend to exacerbate beach loss and beach erosion. So we're looking at sort of protection of a private resource at the expense of a public resource. So there's obviously commons issues there. But we also see a lot of areas where we have shore protection where we've had to sacrifice lateral shoreline access. So those are kind of some of the trade-offs that we have to make for protection. The last adaptation category is retreat, or what I like to call realignment. And that's sort of centers around the idea that as the shoreline moves further landward, we should just kind of move with it. Obviously, if you don't live on the shoreline, that sounds like a great idea. If you do live on the shoreline, it doesn't. It's very contentious, and we don't have a lot of programs in place to do that. Things like acquisition of coastal lands and transferable development rights, they're great options, but we don't have those programs today, at least here in Hawaii. So it's really going to require us to develop some new programs and new funding streams to allow us to do some of this. That being said, I'd like to point out an example. How many folks here have ever been to Hilo on Hawaii Island? Okay, most of you. Hilo, Hawaii? Yeah. So when you drive down the Hilo Bayfront, you know, you're surrounded by all this open green space. It didn't always used to be that way. They had to suffer, that whole area used to be developed. There used to be a railroad track that ran through there, and there was buildings all along the Hilo Bayfront. In the 40s and 50s and 60s, there was 3 consecutive very damaging tsunamis that basically leveled downtown Hilo, particularly that portion where all the nice open spaces are. It happened the first time, they rebuilt. It happened the second time, they rebuilt. It happened the third time, and the community at this point, I mean, this was all in a matter of a decade or just over a decade, they really just couldn't stomach doing it again. So they embarked on what they called the Kaiko'o Urban Renewal Project, which was a partnership between the state and local government and the community And they basically made the decision to repurpose and rezone that land to open space and convert it to parks. It is, in my experience, having done this for a long time, probably the best example of managed retreat and hazard mitigation that I've ever seen. They basically eliminated vulnerability and transferred their assets to another portion of the community and invested in rebuilding that portion of the community that was a little bit safer. So this is something that was done in the 60s. It was done before the adoption of a lot of our environmental rules. It was done before we were as progressive and proactive as we like to think we are now. So this is, when people say we can't do it, I always kind of like to show them that example. So what options do we have available within these categories? Again, I'm not going to read this to you because that would just be painful. If you read these for yourselves, can anybody tell me the one thing that all of these have in common? It's okay, I'll tell you. They all exist today. We have them all. We just haven't developed them. So this isn't a situation where we don't have any, we have an overwhelming problem. Sea level rise is something that, especially the long-term projections, we're looking at really large magnitude change along our shorelines. It's not like we don't have the tools available to us. We just have to cultivate them and develop the programs that support their implementation. Any one of these adaptation strategies is going to be appropriate in certain situations and not others. So we need to develop ways to evaluate our situations to determine which adaptation option is appropriate. For example, I mentioned shoreline hardening in kind of a condescending fashion of, it's never desirable. Shoreline hardening might be the right choice in a lot of cases where we don't have a beach resource and we have nothing to lose, whereas places like Waikiki or Ka'anapali Beach on Maui that really rely on the beach to drive their tourism-based economy and are huge contributors to our state GDP, beach nourishment might be a better option so we can maintain that amenity both for our visitor population and the public. So we need to develop this portfolio and better understand the application of these different adaptation options and the situations in which to apply them and build the programs to support them. So where does adaptation fit? Again, I'm not going to read this to you. Basically, it fits everywhere. There are no sectors that are immune to it. All of these different sectors of governance are going to have to address this problem. All these different economic sectors will have to address these problems. Just a couple of examples from the planning perspective. We deal with shoreline setbacks, we deal with property subdivision, development applications. Clearly, we need to be considering sea level rise in that. From an agricultural perspective, looking at places like the Mana Plain over on the south shore of Kauai, West Kauai, areas that are going to have more nuisance flooding and more groundwater inundation, trying to figure out how we're going to adapt our agriculture to maintain that sector. Transportation, obviously a major concern in areas like Ka'ava and Laniakea, that we have basically key transportation routes that are right up against the shoreline today. Laniakea is a great example. The State Department of Transportation is already looking at realigning the highway at Laniakea about 0.8 miles inland to just move it away from the shoreline. And we need to be thinking about things like that. So I'd like to talk, how am I doing on time? Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the Hawaii Climate Adaptation Initiative. This is a project that I'm working on that our office is coordinating. It's really exciting for us. We submitted a bill to the legislature in 2014 requesting funds to allow us to work on sea level rise. And they liked it and they passed the bill, and they gave DLNR about $400,000 to invest in the science and the planning, which we're just beginning that process now. The three things that it authorized us to do was to create an interagency climate adaptation committee, which consists of key department heads in different government agencies, Office of Planning, Department of Land and Natural Resources, Department of Transportation, Health. Basically, they're providing the leadership, and the Department of Land and Natural Resources and the Office of Planning are sort of the co-chairs, and they're driving the planning side of it. We have a consultant that we've hired to help us do a vulnerability assessment to assess the socioeconomic impacts and the physical impacts of sea level rise, and then we're putting all of that into a report to the legislature. Keyword being report. This isn't actually the plan for how we're going to move forward. It's basically a report to them saying this is the situation and this is what we need from you to support us going forward so we can develop plans and policies to address these issues. But it's an exciting project. We've got a great group of people working on it. This is sort of a breakdown of the Climate Adaptation Committee and how that looks. The two key advantages with this are never before have we had a direct line of communication with so many department heads. A lot of these projects tend to happen within one department and then just get reported to the legislature. In this case, we have these folks for 3 years. We have quarterly meetings with them. We're doing a big workshop with them next month with hands-on exercises to work through different sea level rise issues. And we believe that through educating those folks top down through their agencies, that we can kind of make sea level rise a household name, not just within our department at DLNR, but within the other programs as well. And that could be the catalyst that really kickstarts the planning that needs to happen. The other key factor with the committee is that this report that we're doing, the legislature is required that it be updated every 5 years. So this committee has a life. It's not a one-time committee. It's not a one-time report. So we're developing the first report, but already thinking about sort of the next 5 years and the next 5 years and planning for that. We're investing heavily in shoreline change modeling. The University of Hawaii Coastal Geology Group, we've contracted them for the past 4 years to do this work. They just recently, about 6 months ago, published a paper that was pretty alarming. They modeled shoreline change under future sea level rise scenarios using a combination of different modeling techniques, the Bruin rule and the Davidson-Arnott models. And what they found was that by 2050, about 92% of Hawaii's shorelines would exhibit a trend of recession, so erosion, and some of them between 1 and 24 meters of erosion. That's about twice the historical rate of erosion here. So we're looking at a doubling of our erosion rates by mid-century, and that same project about 2.5 times the erosion by the end of the century. So this confirmed what we kind of intuitively already knew, but it's really bad news. So we're trying to figure out how to operate with this. These are just a couple of graphics from that report. I like to include this one. I'm sorry, not this one. I like to include this one from Kailua. Many of you know, if you're familiar with Kailua, that it's one of the few accreting beaches in Hawaii. The beach is actually growing year to year. Unfortunately, the development has sort of grown with it and moved further seaward, but this is the shoreline change projections for Kailua, and as you can see, we're projecting that around mid-century that accretion trend is going to reverse itself and it's going to go into an erosion trend. So that development that has been incrementally following the shoreline and moving further seaward is now going to be forced to try to retreat. So we have serious concerns with that. This is another graphic just to kind of visualize. These are a lot of the different areas that were modeled in this study. And you can see the red boxes there are on the recession side, whereas the advancement or the accretion side is to the right. You can see that the vast majority of shorelines are looking to recede in the coming century. These are just some maps that we've created from that, showing the scenarios for 2050 and 2100. Yeah, I think it's 2050. So we're using this modeling to inform the work that we're doing with the Climate Committee and the report that we're developing for the legislature. We're also developing a web-based mapping tool with Pakayus, basically leveraging the architecture they already built for previous tools and integrating this new shoreline change modeling into that. We focused on 4 pilot areas right now. These are you can see the lines on the map, the green through the red. Those are basically the not projected shorelines, but projections for the areas that will be exposed to erosion hazard within those periods of time. So that red line, the furthest Malka line, basically everything seaward of that line will be potentially exposed to erosion by 2100. This is just an example with FEMA flood zones included, so you can see that the flood zones are grossly inadequate based on our modeling projections. We provide all of that data downloadable, so GIS analysts in different departments can download it and use it for planning purposes. So I'm almost finished. I kind of wanted to end with the good news and the bad news. I'll start with the bad news. So sea level rise is going to continue. It's likely to accelerate, and the end is not in sight. 2100 is a planning horizon. It's a target for us, but we don't expect sea level rise to magically stop rising at 2100. Our future projections are likely conservative at this point. We have serious concerns about a major collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet and how that can contribute to not only a higher rate of sea level rise, but a faster rate. Our existing policies do not account for sea level rise. That is a limitation that we're working on through the Climate Adaptation Committee. I kind of discussed a lot of the different implications of the landward migration to the shoreline, both from a physical impacts perspective, an economic perspective, and a governance perspective. And lastly, adaptation is not going to be cheap. A lot of our pre-existing development, particularly in densely populated urban areas, the investment's already been made. The dollars have already been spent. It's difficult to justify spending more dollars to maintain something as it exists today. It's even more difficult to justify abandoning something that you have so much invested in, whether it be a home or a resort, or even a piece of critical infrastructure that's operated by government. A good example of that is the Wailuku Kahului wastewater facility on Maui. They're investing in building a rock revetment to protect the facility, which was threatened by the tsunami in 2011, the Tohoku, Japan tsunami. Basically, it's going to cost them about $150 million to move that facility, to basically decommission it, shut it down, do all the cleanup work, build a new facility, and they don't have a site for a new facility identified. So in the short term, their only option is to really harden. So we've worked with them to develop a hybrid solution there where we're doing, in addition to the rock revetment, we're doing a dune restoration project as well, to try to maintain more of a buffer there, to basically allow that infrastructure to last as long as it can, to basically squeeze every last dime out of it before we have to reinvest again. And hopefully when we do reinvest, we can do so in a place that will be safer for a longer period of time. So that's some of the bad news. Some of the good news. Adaptation is inevitable. This isn't a choice that we're making today, like we're going to adapt or we're not. This is a choice that's being made for us. I guess you could look at that as bad news as well, but for me, it's really important because I know it's something that's going to happen. It's just a matter of how well we're going to do at it. Folks like you coming out to talks like this is really inspiring for me. People actually care about these issues. They want to learn about them. They're starting to communicate that to government. The fact that the legislature has commissioned us to do this work, this is becoming a priority issue for them. We're increasing their awareness by reporting these issues to them. So that's confidence inspiring for me as well. There's a new emphasis on these issues in the federal government. Just about 2 weeks ago, we were awarded $850,000 grant to explore this stuff further and support the committee work that we're doing. So that's great for us. And there's a lot of different initiatives and solutions being developed. Really radical stuff, architectural designs and engineering solutions that we've never tried before. So it's a time of sort of unprecedented change in those sectors, and it's really exciting. So I think we're headed in the right direction, and I'm inspired by what I'm seeing, and we're going to do some good things. 1 minute. I just wanted to show a couple pictures of things that kind of take home things to think about. They're doing the flood mitigation project for the Alawai Canal now. The Army Corps of Engineers is doing the planning for that. They are not considering sea level rise in that project because it's a terrestrial flooding project. They're doing the floodplain management for the valley and the coastal floodplain, but they're not considering sea level rise. This is what that area looks like during heavy rain events. So there's 37 cranes operating in downtown Honolulu right now. That's the most we've ever had at once. We have an enormous number of new condominium complexes and sky rises being built, none of which have addressed sea level rise in their plans and permits. So those are just a few things to think about and why it's so important that we do this work. We just launched a new website a couple weeks ago. It's new, so it's growing, but I encourage you to go take a look at it. And I'd like to thank you for your time. Appreciate you coming out on a Sunday. And yeah,
We have about 5 minutes for some questions for Andy. So 2 minutes, any questions?
yes.
The report to the legislature will be prepared, ready for doing that.
It's December 31st, 2017. So it's due to the legislature by the end of 2017. And then this grant that we recently got just a few weeks ago is actually going to be, the projects we're doing under that are kind of overlapping with that. So it's really kind of cool. We're going to deliver the report to the legislature. And in that report, we're actually going to include legislative bills for the 2018 session. So the recommendations we're making in the report, we're going to craft them as bills. So here's your report. We're telling you what we think we need to do. And by the way, this is a resource request. Here's the bills attached to that. And then this overlapping project that we just got funded for is it's going to expand that web-based tool that I was showing you. It's also going to be developing guidelines for how to integrate the recommendations from the report into our existing planning frameworks. So basically the stuff that the bills are supposed to fund, we're going to develop recommendations for how to do it. And then we're also getting into post-disaster recovery planning. So basically saying, okay, if we have a disaster and we have an opportunity to rebuild in the wake of that, this is where we should implement adaptation when we have the opportunity. So it's kind of a really cool overlap. We're really excited about that. So, yeah. And it's all publicly available, and the Climate Adaptation Committee meetings are public. So if anyone wants to attend them, if they want to call in with questions, they can call in. It's designed to be very transparent. We're just getting started too, so I've been really impressed with the level of participation from the department heads. We were kind of concerned that they'd just be like, oh, it's another committee I have to work on. But they've really come in guns blazing and asked us a lot of really penetrating questions, and they seem really invested in it. So it's really good. Do you have a question?
I think it's great the way the state is taking action, and you thought this group organized to reach into different areas of the state government. But it strikes me listening, because I live part-time in California too, that a lot of what you're talking about applies to obviously many more places. The Bay Area, for example, they're buying old marshlands to restore it to naturals as one of those softening techniques you talked about, without having to put in seawalls. I'm just wondering, is it possible for you as a organization, or through some organizations that represent you, to reach out to other states and coordinate it at the state level as well, without necessarily going to the federal government, which is so bureaucratic? But it seems like everybody's inventing the wheel themselves. And if you could tap into what Louisiana's got so many of these, water problems and things.
Right.
You might be able to help each other at the state level just by reaching out state to state.
We are doing some of that. It's a great idea. I think the big challenge for us, so yeah, to answer your question, we're definitely doing that. We're looking at things like living shorelines and stuff like that. The big challenge for Hawaii is the morphology of our shorelines and the wave climate. Most of the other places that we deal with, like the East Coast, a lot of those places have either dune buffers or they're at elevation, and they kind of deal with storms, but they don't deal with kind of the constant attack from waves that we have out here. We don't have a lot of area to work with here along the shoreline, but I think we have a lot of inland area to work with, especially in Oahu. So I think we can learn a lot from the other states, but I think ultimately it's got to be kind of homegrown here.
Sure.
To fit the situation. Be honest, up until just the last 2 years, we've had no resources to address this issue. Everybody complains about funding, but we are severely underfunded as an agency, we being DLNR. Up until about 2 years ago, we had less than $1 million a year to deal with all the beach erosion throughout the whole state. And that was without even touching the sea level rise issue. So we're kind of, we've just gotten a huge boost with these last 2 projects to really start doing a lot of stuff that we wanted to do. So it's an exciting time for us. Yes, sir.
It's the amount of energy that ends up being wasted that causes this climate change. Are we doing anything nationwide and worldwide to find ways to have energy but not creating the excess energy that's heating the world?
Yeah, that's like a whole nother presentation. But yeah, I do think we are doing a lot of good things there. Particularly in Hawaii, we've done a lot with solar. 10 years ago, there was not a lot of solar here, and we have a lot of it now. We've made a lot of progress there. I don't know how to address that question quickly. I think the renewable energy sector, it's really evolved so much in the last 5 years, and I don't see that changing. I think the issue is that the greenhouse gas emissions that we have today, there's sort of a lag effect where what we put into the atmosphere now, it's going to be another 30 years before it's actually taken up by the oceans completely. And so it's not like we just stop today and things start getting better. So, but I am encouraged by what I see in the renewable sectors. In Hawaii, we have the Aloha Plus Challenge here. I think the target for renewables by 2050 is like 80%, something like that. So Hawaii has definitely become a world leader in that area. And to that effect, we have reached out to other places like the Netherlands for, for instruction on how to do that. And so I'm encouraged by what I see there.